Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a suite of affordability measures this morning, steps he says will help Canadian families struggling.
Trade talks terminated. President Trump has announced that he is ending negotiations with Canada, all over an advertisement put out by Ontario's government.
At a moment when global supply chains are breaking down and grocery prices are climbing everywhere, Canada made a move no one in Washington expected. Not a press conference, not a threat, not a negotiation. Mark Carney stood inside a grocery store in Ottawa and announced $500 million to protect Canada's food supply from Donald Trump's tariff threats. This wasn't panic spending. It wasn't defensive economics. It was a declaration. Canada is preparing to feed itself, no matter what happens at the American border. For decades, Canada and the United States operated as a single, deeply integrated food system. Canadian farmers raised beef and pork that crossed the border for processing. American fruits and vegetables flowed north into Canadian supermarkets. Ingredients, packaging, and finished food products crossed the border multiple times before reaching store shelves. The entire system was built on one assumption: trade would remain open, tariffs would stay low, and political stability would hold. That assumption collapsed the moment Donald Trump turned tariffs into a weapon. Trump's trade war hit Canada hard: 25% tariffs on steel, 35% on non-trade agreement goods, public threats of 100% tariffs if Canada pursued deeper trade ties with China. Suddenly, food, something most countries treat as untouchable, became leverage. Canadian farmers watched export markets shrink almost overnight. Beef prices dropped 22%. Pork exports fell 8%. Canola shipments to the United States declined sharply. At the same time, Canadian grocery prices surged 6.2% year over year as supply chains fractured and higher costs were passed directly to consumers. Trump believed economic pain would force Canada back to the table on American terms. Instead, he handed Mark Carney the political justification to do something Canada should have done decades ago: build food sovereignty. Carney's announcement marks the beginning of a structural transformation. The centerpiece is $500 million from Canada's Strategic Response Fund, specifically designed to absorb supply chain disruption costs without allowing those costs to land on consumers. This is not a subsidy, it's infrastructure investment. Canadian food companies can now apply for funding to expand processing capacity, upgrade cold storage, strengthen distribution networks, and eliminate choke points that force Canadian food to leave the country just to come back more expensive. Nowhere is this clearer than meat processing. Canada produces enormous amounts of beef and pork, but lacks sufficient domestic processing capacity. For years, Canadian cattle were shipped to American slaughterhouses, processed, then sold back to Canadian grocery stores at marked up prices. Under Trump's tariffs, this system stopped making economic sense. Carney's plan aims to build processing facilities inside Canada, keeping production domestic from start to finish. Once built, that capacity doesn't disappear when tariffs end. It becomes permanent. Alongside this, Carney announced a $150 million food security fund targeting small and medium-sized producers. The focus is greenhouses. Canada currently imports massive quantities of fresh vegetables from California and Mexico because domestic greenhouse capacity can't meet demand, especially in winter. That dependency becomes dangerous when trade relationships deteriorate. The new funding allows greenhouse operators to expand rapidly. Even more important, Canada introduced immediate expensing for greenhouse construction. Any greenhouse operational before 2030 can be written off entirely in the year it's built. That is an enormous tax incentive, and it creates urgency. Canada has already been expanding greenhouse production for years. Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec now grow tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and lettuce year-round, but the industry never reached the scale needed for true self-sufficiency. This plan changes that. Within 5 years, Canada could eliminate billions in vegetable imports from the United States entirely. There's also $20 million for food banks through the Local Food Infrastructure Fund. On the surface, it looks like social spending. In reality, it strengthens local supply chains by creating steady demand for Canadian-produced food at the community level. It keeps food local and money circulating domestically. Trump failed to understand one critical truth: threaten steel or aluminum, and governments negotiate. Threaten food security, and governments act. When Trump's tariffs hit agriculture, the political pressure on Carney was intense. The traditional response would have been concessions, dairy access, lumber quotas, something to restore exports to the United States. Instead, Carney flipped the logic. He told farmers that dependence on American markets was the vulnerability, not the solution. He promised investment, not appeasement. This is permanent change. Once Canada builds slaughterhouses, greenhouse networks, and domestic distribution systems, they don't vanish when trade disputes cool down. They replace American imports for decades. And American agricultural exporters are beginning to realize what this means. Canada is a major market for U.S. produce, processed foods, meat products, and grains. If Canada becomes self-sufficient in key categories, those export markets disappear permanently. Trump's tariffs aren't just hurting current sales, they're destroying future access. Greenhouse expansion is the most strategically important piece. Canada's short growing season has always forced winter imports. Modern greenhouses have changed that reality. LED lighting, climate control, hydroponics, these systems allow year-round production even in Canadian winters. Yes, they're energy intensive, but once transportation costs, tariffs, and supply disruptions are factored in, they're increasingly competitive with field-grown imports from the United States. Ontario already leads North America in greenhouse vegetable production. British Columbia and Quebec are close behind. The new funding accelerates an industry that was already growing, pushing it toward full national self-sufficiency. And once these greenhouses are built, they rely on Canadian energy, water, and labor. They're immune to Trump's tariffs. This food strategy isn't isolated. It fits perfectly into Carney's broader plan to reduce Canadian dependence on the United States. There's the $70 billion Buy Canadian Procurement Initiative, Arctic infrastructure projects opening shipping routes to Europe and Asia, the China trade deal unlocking billions in agricultural exports. Each move weakens the leverage tariffs once provided. The sequence is devastatingly effective. Trump applies pressure. Canada absorbs the shock. Carney uses that pressure to justify domestic investment. Farmers pivot to serving Canadian markets. Greenhouse operators expand aggressively. Within 5 years, Canada no longer needs the U.S. for critical food categories. At that point, American agricultural tariffs become meaningless. This is economic judo. Trump pushes harder, and Canada builds faster. Carney announced this plan in a grocery store for a reason. Canadians are furious about food prices. 6.2% annual increases are politically toxic. Carney can't stop global inflation, but he can point to Trump as the source of supply chain disruption and position his government as the shield protecting families. That framing makes the plan politically bulletproof. Opponents can't attack it without appearing to side with Trump against Canadian households. American farmers understand what's coming. Canada currently sends cattle south for processing, supporting jobs in rural America. Once Canada builds its own facilities, those jobs disappear. California growers ship massive volumes of produce north. When Canadian greenhouses reach scale, that market vanishes. Some U.S. agricultural groups warned Trump this would happen. He ignored them. Now the process is irreversible. Greenhouses take time to build, but once operational, they produce indefinitely. Processing plants require capital and approvals, but once opened, they anchor domestic supply chains. The immediate expensing deadline ensures construction accelerates now. By 2030, Canada's food landscape will look fundamentally different. Even if Trump reverses tariffs tomorrow, the investments won't stop. Canadian companies will see the profit in serving domestic markets without cross-border risk. The $500 million plan is only the first step. School food programs, government procurement, reduced interprovincial trade barriers, and diversified export markets are all reinforcing the same outcome. Trump thought food tariffs would give him leverage. Instead, he triggered a transformation that makes Canada permanently less dependent on American agriculture. That's not pressure, that's strategic failure. And American agricultural exporters are only just beginning to understand what they lost.